My name is Leah Ramirez. I am 38 years old. At my cousin Rose's quinceañera last April, my uncle Marco stood up in the middle of dinner without being asked and gave a speech about complicity. And every single person in that fellowship hall knew he was talking about me. I sat at table 3 with my untouched chicken and my good blouse, and I did not say a word. I had been practicing not saying a word for 3 years. What I didn't know, while I was sitting there watching the candle in the centerpiece throw shadows across the tablecloth, was that a woman I didn't recognize was in the parking lot. She had driven 4 hours from El Paso with a 2-year-old boy in a car seat and a piece of paper with my name on it that a volunteer coordinator had written out for her after 18 months of searching. When she walked into that fellowship hall and crossed the room toward my table with her son on her hip and tears already on her face, the DJ dropped the music, the conversations dropped, my uncle stopped mid-sentence. She reached my chair and she looked at me and she said, in Spanish, "You are the reason my son is alive." I still don't know what I said back. I don't think I said anything. I think I just looked at her boy, who had dark curly hair and round serious eyes and was chewing on the collar of her dress. I think I just looked at him and understood that the last 3 years of my life had been working toward this moment in a way I hadn't been able to see while I was inside them. That is where I need to start, because everything before it matters if you're going to understand what happened in that room and what it cost to get there and what it eventually gave back. My father died when I was 14 years old. His name was Roberto Ramirez, and he was a high school shop teacher in San Antonio, Texas, and he had a heart attack on a Tuesday morning in October while he was driving to school. He was 41 years old. He pulled the truck over before he lost consciousness, which was the kind of thing my father did. He thought about other people even when he was dying. He was found by a woman walking her dog, and he didn't make it to the hospital. There are things I know about that morning only because people told me later. My mother was at work. I was in second period algebra. My father was in a truck on the side of Fredericksburg Road, and the whole world continued around him as if nothing had shifted. My uncle Marco was my father's older brother. He was 59 when my father died, and he had already built something of a life, a house in the northeast part of the city, a wife named Consuelo, 3 kids who were mostly grown, a reputation in the community for being the person you called when you needed something explained or advocated for or quietly arranged. He is the kind of man who fills a room when he walks in, not because he's particularly loud, though he can be, but because he has the quality of someone who has been right often enough that people have stopped thinking to argue. He came to our house 3 days after my father's funeral with tamales my Aunt Consuelo had made, and he sat down at our kitchen table across from my mother, and he said, "Elena, I'm going to be around. Not just for the holidays. Around." And for the next 6 years, he was the person who showed up to my school events and picked me up when my mother's car broke down and had the conversation with me about money when I told him I was thinking about the military. He didn't love that idea, but he drove me to the recruiting office himself and shook the recruiter's hand. I served 8 years. Combat medic, United States Army, 2 deployments to Afghanistan, 1 to Kuwait. I came home at 26 with skills that I had paid a price for and a body that showed some of that price. I had a bad left knee from a fall outside Kandahar during a night operation that went sideways, in the particular way that night operations go sideways, which is to say slowly and then all at once. I had a right shoulder that required surgery at Bagram after a vehicle rollover that was not my vehicle and not my accident, but that involved a 22-year-old specialist named James Kohler from Billings, Montana, who was trapped in the passenger seat and needed someone to stay in there with him and monitor his airway while the extraction crew worked. And the angle I maintained for 37 minutes did something to the rotator cuff that healed imperfectly. James Kohler went home. My shoulder aches in cold weather. I consider this a reasonable trade. I came home and I tried a few things that didn't fit quite right. Civilian EMT work was fine, but felt like operating at a fraction of my capacity. Hospital nursing paid better, but the environments were enclosed in ways that sat badly on me after years in the field. A recruiter for a humanitarian rescue unit operating in coordination with the Border Patrol's Search and Rescue Division in southern Arizona sent me an email through a Veterans Employment Network, and I read it on a Tuesday night in my apartment eating cereal, and I thought, that sounds like the work. I drove out there in my old truck 3 weeks later. I want to be specific about what the job actually was, because specificity matters here, and because for 3 years I allowed people around me to define it in terms that felt like a translation with all the meaning removed. I drove a modified pickup truck into remote desert terrain with a medical pack that weighed roughly 42 pounds and a GPS unit and a radio, and I found people who were dying. That is the short version. The longer version is that I found people who had been abandoned by smugglers when they got sick or slowed down or could no longer walk. I found people who had been walking for days on 2 liters of water in 114-degree heat. I found people with core temperatures of 107. I found people with feet blistered down to the bone who had been walking in shoes made of plastic and tape. I found people with blood pressure so low my equipment could barely read it. I carried IV bags and cooling blankets and oral rehydration solution and dextrose, and I kept people alive until the helicopters arrived. I did this in the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer off the ground, and I did it in nights cold enough that the ground held frost. And I did it in the specific darkness of the desert, far from any road or light, a darkness so complete it has a physical quality, a weight that presses back. I was not an immigration officer. I did not carry zip ties or cuffs. I did not make any determination about anyone's legal status or process anyone through any system. By the time I reached the people I was called for, the only operative question in the entire universe was whether they would still be breathing in the next 30 to 60 minutes. And everything else was a conversation for a different day with different people. Uncle Marco knew this. He knew it at the beginning. He came to my going away dinner before I drove out to Arizona, and he hugged me and said, "Mija, you go save them." And I believed him. I believed that was how he saw it. I held on to that version of him through my first summer in the desert, which was the hardest work I had ever done, harder than anything in the military, because the military gave you a unit and a structure and people who understood the context. And this was me and a partner named Tina and a truck and a radio and the desert, which does not care about context. The shift happened slowly enough that I almost missed it until I was already inside it. Marco had always done community advocacy. He had helped found a nonprofit in San Antonio that connected newly arrived immigrants with legal aid, making resources, job training, English language classes. This was real work, important work. He was good at it, and he knew he was good at it, and he had been doing it for 20 years when something began to change, or he began to change around it. Somewhere around 3 years before Rosa's quinceañera, he started appearing on a local radio program. He started attending more rallies and political events. He started using different language, words I recognized as the vocabulary of a particular kind of advocacy that is less about the specific person in front of you and more about the argument you're making in public. He started talking about systems, apparatus, infrastructure, carceral machinery, and he started including, when he spoke about the border, the rescue division. Not in the same terms as agents, not like that, but as a feature of the system he was describing, as evidence that the system had learned to present itself with a humanitarian face. And whenever he said that, in family gatherings or at dinner tables where I was sitting, the implication of where I stood in that picture was available for anyone to find if they looked. The first time it happened directly was a Sunday dinner at his house. It was a big gathering, the way his Sunday dinners always are, with cousins and neighbors and his kids and their friends and people drifting in and out through the afternoon. His youngest son, Eddie, was home from college and had brought his roommate, a kid named Jasper, who was writing his senior thesis on immigration enforcement. Jasper asked me across the rice and beans what I did, and I started to explain, and Marco, who was across the table and had been in a different conversation, turned and said, "What Leah does is essentially provide a humanitarian cover for a system that shouldn't exist." The table went quiet in the way that tables go quiet when the air pressure in a room changes. I said, "Marco, I find people who are dying and I keep them alive. He said, I know what you do. I'm saying what the function of it is within the larger system. I said, the function of it is that people don't die. He said, the function of it for the agencies involved is that they can say, we care about these people while maintaining the policies that put them in the desert in the first place. Jasper wrote something in a small notebook. I did not throw my fork. I want to be clear about this because some part of me wanted to, and I am proud that I didn't. I said, I understand that critique. I've thought about that critique, and I still show up every morning because the people in the desert don't have the time to wait for the systemic critique to work itself out before they die of heat exhaustion. And then I ate my rice and I asked Eddie about his classes and I drove home in the dark and I sat in my driveway for 11 minutes with the engine off and the windows up before I went inside. Tina had been my partner in the unit for 2 years at that point. Her full name is Christina Kowalski, and she is 41 years old, and she grew up in Milwaukee, and she looks like someone who sells real estate and works out, which is accurate, and also like someone who can run chest compressions for 20 minutes without breaking rhythm, which is also accurate, and the combination of these two facts is something I have always found very funny. She drove a truck even older than mine, which she considered a personal competitive victory. She ate too much gas station beef jerky on long shifts, and she was working on a crossword puzzle book she'd been at for 3 years and never finished because she always lost the pencil. She was the best field medic I had ever worked with. She called me the morning after the Sunday dinner because I'd sent her the summary at 1 a.m, and she always texted back no matter the hour, even if only to send a single question mark, which is what she sent. And so I called her. She said, walk me through the part where your uncle, who does community organizing, has now developed strong opinions about desert rescue medicine. I said, it's not about the medicine. It's about the politics. She said, it's about you. He's using the argument because he knows where it'll land. I said, I don't think it's that deliberate. She said, Leah, he spent 6 years being your dad. You built a whole career out there in the field where he couldn't follow you, and then you started doing work that he can't take credit for and can't easily categorize, and he found a framework that puts him back in the position of the expert. That's the story. I said, that sounds too clean. She said, I said accurate. I didn't say clean. What followed the Sunday dinner was not a fight. It never became a fight. That would have been cleaner, and I think I would have preferred it. What it became was a long, slow wearing down of the comfort I felt at family events. Marco's opinions about border policy were always present in those spaces, and I was always present in those spaces, and the space between us was always available for people to see and comment on if they chose to. My Aunt Consuelo never commented. She fed me and asked about my knee and pretended not to hear the harder parts of conversations. My cousin Rosa always positioned herself near me at these gatherings, like a small, quiet declaration of loyalty that she never had to make explicit. Eddie liked both his father and me, and managed this by having 2 completely parallel sets of conversations with us simultaneously. The Thanksgiving before the quinceañera was the worst it had been. There was a guest at the table named Dr. Patricia Garza, a sociologist from a university in Austin who had been on a panel with Marco. She was thoughtful and specific in her questions, and I liked her immediately. When she asked me what I did, Marco answered before I could. He said, Leah works in medical support for a border enforcement operation, which is not incorrect the way a map that shows you every road but none of the buildings is not incorrect. It gives you the shape of a thing and removes everything that would make it real. Dr. Garza asked me a follow-up. I described my actual work. She asked good questions. At one point, Marco came in and said, there are arguments that the humanitarian component delays or prevents asylum seekers from pursuing legal channels. I said, Marco, by the time I reach someone in the desert, the question of which legal channel they're going to pursue is not what's happening. I'm keeping them alive so that they can pursue any channel at all. He said, structurally, the humanitarian work functions as a legitimizing layer for enforcement. I said, structurally, if I hadn't found the 7 people I found last August, they would be 7 more names on the medical examiner's list. Doctor, Garza looked at us both and then asked me about heat protocols and extreme temperature rescues, and we talked about that for 10 minutes, and Marco refilled everyone's wine glass with the focused energy of someone who has decided to let a conversation run out of oxygen. I drove home in the dark, and I called my mother. Leah Ramirez is 61 years old and still lives in the house I grew up in, and still makes coffee on the stove the way she always has, and still gives advice in the particular way she always has, which is to say, indirectly and without editorial and entirely correctly. She listened to all of it, and then she said, Mija, he loves you. I said, I know that. She said, love doesn't always look like what you need. I said, I know that too. She said, come home for Christmas. I went home for Christmas. I went to 3 more Sunday dinners over the following 8 months. I ate Consuelo's tamales, and I talked to Rosa about the quinceañera planning, and I talked to Eddie about the job search, and I talked to Marco about everything except the thing that sat between us at every table like a third guest. Neither of us had invited, and neither of us was going to ask to leave. I had stopped defending myself in those conversations, not because I agreed with his critique. I had thought about the critique from every angle I could find, and I still could not locate myself inside the word complicity in a way that felt honest. But I had decided that defending myself required a kind of energy I was spending in the desert, and I could not maintain both. The invitation to Rosa's quinceañera came 6 weeks before the event. Paper, pink and gold foil, addressed by hand to Leah, plus guest. I felt something tighten in my chest when I read it. Not because I didn't want to celebrate Rosa. Rosa is one of the people I love without conditions. Always has been, even when we were kids and she was annoying and I was older and had no patience for it. The tightening was because the guest list would include Marco's entire orbit, and I knew I was going to sit in that fellowship hall and be a topic. Tina said she'd come as my +1. She said she was bringing a flask, which was a joke, mostly. She said, Rosa deserves to have you there and you deserve a witness, so I'm the witness. She wore a yellow dress to the event that was so aggressively yellow it made the room look more like a quinceañera. She looked completely out of context in the best possible way. I arrived early because I always arrive early. I cannot help it. It is the specific flaw of someone trained to be in position before anything happens. I was at the fellowship hall 40 minutes before the guests started coming in. I helped Rosa's mother move 2 folding tables. I refilled the punch bowl before the caterer arrived. By the time people started filtering in, I had been there long enough to have opinions about the seating arrangement. Tina arrived 20 minutes after me eating a gas station sandwich and immediately located the appetizer table. The fellowship hall was attached to a church on the northeast side of the city, not far from the neighborhood where Marco and Consuelo lived. It was a large rectangular room with fluorescent lighting along the perimeter and round folding tables that seated 8, and pink tablecloths that were slightly too short for the tables, and a DJ in the corner setting up his equipment with the focused energy of someone who takes this more seriously than most people take their careers. There was a flower arch near the entrance, made of artificial roses and real greenery, that Rosa stood in front of for photographs when she arrived. And she looked the way people look on the days of their lives when everything lines up exactly as it should, slightly more vivid than usual, like someone had turned up the saturation on a photograph of her. Marco arrived with Consuelo and a small group of people I recognized and some I didn't. He hugged me when he came in. He called me mija. He meant it. He always means everything, which is part of what makes the hard moments hard, because there is no dishonesty to hide behind. His affection is real and his opinions are real, and for the last 3 years they had been in direct conflict with each other and he had let the opinions do the talking. The party was beautiful, and I want to say that clearly before I get to the part that wasn't. The decorations were pink and gold, and the food was good, and the DJ had taste, and Rosa danced with her father and her brothers and her friends, and cried twice and laughed constantly, and the whole room loved her. I ate my chicken and drank my punch and talked to Rosa's friends' parents about things I don't remember, and sat at table 3 next to Tina, who was managing the appetizer situation by keeping a steady supply moving in her direction. The problem started at the dinner portion. There were speeches. The speeches were warm and appropriate, and Rosa cried a 3rd time during one of them. And then Marco stood up. He had not been on any program. He stood up with a glass and he spoke for 7 minutes about Rosa and about family and about what it means to carry your name with integrity into the world. It was generous and true, and everyone applauded. And then he did not sit down. He said, I want to add one more thing. He said, we have a generation behind us who is going to inherit a world where what we do with our choices matters enormously. He did not look at me. He didn't need to. 47 people did the math. He said, I've watched people I care about navigate systems that require difficult compromises, and I think the willingness to live with ambiguity is not the same as the willingness to live with complicity. He said it in the warmest tone you can use for something with an edge in it. He sat down to the applause of a room that was slightly uncertain what it had agreed to. I put my fork down. I thought about a man I found the previous August. His name was Ernesto, we found out later. He was 44 years old and from Guatemala, and he had 3 children, and he had been in the desert for 3 days when Tina and I got the GPS coordinates from the relay station. When I put the blood pressure cuff on him, his systolic was 60. His skin had the particular texture of severe dehydration, dry and tinted, the kind that makes a medical person do a rapid internal calculation about how many minutes are left. I ran a line into his arm in the dark with a headlamp, and I squeezed the IV bag by hand because the pressure was too low for the bag to work on gravity alone, and I talked to him while I did it, not words he could understand, because his Spanish was different from mine. In my field, Spanish is imperfect anyway, but sound, voice, the presence of another person. I said, stay, just stay. I said it in English, and I said it with everything I had. His color came back. When the helicopter landed, it was the most welcome sound I have heard in my life. When they lifted him on the board, he turned his head and looked at me, and I don't know what he saw, but I know what I felt. I excused myself from the table and went to the bathroom. The bathroom in the fellowship hall had fluorescent lights that buzzed slightly, and a soap dispenser that required 3 pumps to produce anything, and paper towels that jammed if you pulled too fast. I stood at the sink and I looked at myself for what I estimated was 4 minutes. My right shoulder was aching the way it does when I've been carrying tension in it, which is a pattern my physical therapist has named and addressed, and which keeps happening anyway. I had a run in my pantyhose that I had noticed at dinner. I was 38 years old, and I had spent 7 years pulling people out of the desert, and in this fellowship hall with its pink tablecloths and its DJ and its family who loved me in complicated ways, not one of the 47 people in that room had a complete picture of what I did or what it cost. Tina pushed open the bathroom door and leaned against the frame. She said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I'm fine." She said, "You've been in here 4 minutes, and you have that face." I said, "What face?" She said, "The face where you've already left internally, but you're still physically present." She paused. She said, "Also, something is happening in the hall and you should come see." I didn't understand what she meant until we walked out. The DJ had lowered the music, not turned it off, lowered it. The way you lower something when something else in a room is asking for quiet. The conversations at most tables had dropped too. People were looking at the entrance to the fellowship hall, and I followed their eyes. A young woman was standing in the doorway. She was perhaps 27 years old, with dark hair pulled back and a blue dress that was slightly more formal than the day had required her to be, the kind of dress you put on when you want to be presentable for something that matters. She had a boy on her hip. He was around 2 years old, with dark curly hair and round, serious brown eyes, and the gravity of a child who has recently discovered he can walk on his own and is still deciding when it's worth doing. She was looking around the room with the particular searching quality of someone who knows a name but needs to match it to a face. She said something to the woman standing nearest to her at the door. The woman pointed at my table. The young woman with the boy started walking across the fellowship hall. It is a large room. It takes some time to cross it. I watched her the entire way. I watched her because I could feel that she was coming toward me, and I did not know who she was. In 7 years, I had provided emergency medical care to several hundred people in the field. I do not always retain faces. The situations I enter are not the kind that lend themselves to formal introduction. By the time I arrive, people are usually not in a state for conversation. By the time they're in a state for conversation, they're usually in a helicopter, and I'm walking back to my truck. She stopped in front of my chair. The crying was already happening, had been happening before she reached me, but it was not the crying of grief. It was the crying of someone who has been holding something for a long time and has finally found the specific place they were looking for to set it down. She said, in Spanish, "Are you Leah Ramirez, the one from the desert?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I have been looking for you for 2 years." The fellowship hall had gone quiet enough that I could hear the smoke machine fan still running in the corner. She said, "My name is Marisol. My son's name is Miguel." She shifted him on her hip so I could see his face more clearly. She said, "You found us in the desert. It was 3 years ago, in August. He was very sick. His fever was very high and he wouldn't wake up properly and I didn't know what was going to happen. And you came and you held his hand and you talked to him so he wouldn't be scared, even though he couldn't understand you. And you put something in his arm and you gave me your water and you said to me in Spanish, 'You can't help him if you pass out. So drink.' And you held his IV bag in the wind for 45 minutes until the helicopter came." She said, "He is 3 years old now. He looked at me with round, serious eyes and chewed the collar of her dress." She said, "He was supposed to die in that desert." The doctor at the hospital told me later, when I was well enough to understand what they were saying, that whoever found us right at the edge of the window. He said that the next hour would have been different. She said, "I didn't know your name for a long time. They don't always tell you. But a woman at the organization where I got help, she helped me find the records. She found your name. She wrote it on a piece of paper. And she said, someone in the rescue unit gave us her name because they thought she would want to know. And I was going to write you a letter, but I didn't know the address. And then someone said you had family in San Antonio, and someone who knew someone told me you'd be here today. So I drove from El Paso." She said, "I just needed you to know." I heard the sound of a chair moving at the head table, and I recognized it, without turning to look, as my Uncle Marco. I stood up. I'm not sure why exactly, except that it felt wrong to have her standing above me while I sat. I stood up and I said, "He's beautiful." Because he was. He was looking at me with the composed curiosity of a child who is taking in new information and deciding what he thinks about it. She said, "Yes." And then she started crying harder, the way you cry when something that has been building for 2 years finally reaches the surface. She said, "Thank you." She said it in English. She said it the way someone says a thing they have been practicing for a long time, in the car and the quiet before sleep and the hours they thought about how this moment might go. I said, "You didn't have to drive all this way." She said, "Yes, I did." I heard my Aunt Consuelo say something quiet to Marco. I did not hear what Rosa had her hand over her mouth. Tina materialized beside me in the way she always does in situations that require her simply present before you've registered that she moved. Tina said to Marisol in her serviceable Spanish, "Please sit down. We're going to find you some water and some food and you're going to sit down." Marisol sat down at my table. Tina went to find water. Miguel looked at me. He reached out and grabbed my finger with his whole fist, the way very small children do, with the absolute confidence of someone who has decided that whatever is within reach belongs to them. I sat back down. I held his hand. I looked at him and I thought about what he had looked like 3 years ago in the desert at night, when the temperature had dropped and the stars were out and a baby was burning up in the dark and I had 6 things to do at once and no guarantee any of them would be enough. I thought about how small a sick child is, how completely present they are in their crisis, no ability to abstract it or survive it mentally because the body is the whole world at that age. I thought about the 45 minutes of standing there holding that bag in the wind and counting breaths. I said to Marisol, "I didn't know if he made it. You don't always find out. They take people away in the helicopter and you go back to the truck." She said, "He made it." I said, "I can see that." Footsteps. And then Marco was standing at the edge of the table. He was not performing any expression. He was looking at Marisol, and then at Miguel, and then at me, and the expression on his face was one I had not seen on him before in 38 years of knowing him. It was not guilt exactly. It was something older and quieter than guilt. He said, Mija. I said, Marco. He said, who is this? I said, her name is Marisol. Her son is Miguel. 3 years ago, I found them in the Sonoran Desert in the middle of the night when this boy was severely dehydrated and going into shock. I administered emergency IV fluids and stayed with them until the medevac arrived. She came here tonight because she wanted me to know that he survived. Marco looked at the boy. Miguel had released my finger and was now fully committed to reaching the centerpiece, a pink silk flower arrangement in a vase that had been catching his attention for some time. Marisol gently redirected his arm without breaking eye contact with Marco. Consuelo arrived beside him. She sat down across from Marisol and introduced herself and immediately began doing the things she does in situations that require warmth, which is to ask specific questions and listen to the answers and find something practical to address. She asked about the drive. She asked whether the boy needed something to eat. She asked whether Marisol had a place to stay tonight. All of it in Spanish, warm and without condescension, the way Consuelo has always moved through the world. Marco sat down. He was quiet for a moment. He said, 3 years ago, August, you said. I said, late August. He was quiet again. He put both hands flat on the table. Then he said, I remember. I didn't know it was you, but I remember the message. Someone from the rescue unit called the organization that summer. I was in a meeting. Someone else took the message. It said a woman and an infant had been extracted from the desert in critical condition and were being treated, and contact was being sought for support resources. He stopped. He said, I saw the message 2 days later. I was glad. I was glad someone was out there doing that work, and I didn't think to ask more questions. I said, okay. He said, I should have asked. I should have called back. I said, Marco. He said, let me finish. He looked at Miguel, who was becoming increasingly determined about the silk flower. He said, I have spent 3 years talking about the system as if the people in it are only their function within it. As if you are only your function within it. And I have done that because it is easier to argue about a structure than to sit with the fact that my niece drives into the desert at night and stays until the light comes, and that I don't have a vocabulary for that fits my argument. He stopped. He said, and because I was afraid that if I said plainly that what you do is necessary and important and costs you things I can't see, I would have to account for why I spent the last 2 years calling it something else. The fellowship hall was not pretending to have other conversations anymore. Rosa was very still at the head table. Eddie had his hand on his father's shoulder. A woman at the neighboring table had stopped eating and was simply watching us. I said, I'm not asking you to say that. He said, I know that. I'm not saying it because you asked. He looked at Marisol. He said, in Spanish, I am sorry that I didn't call back. I didn't know it was your child. I still should have called back. Marisol looked at him for a long moment. The particular long moment of someone who has spent years distributing this specific look among many people and has developed a very precise understanding of what it costs to give it. She said, many people didn't call back. He said, I know. He didn't add anything to that. Tina came back with 2 glasses of water and a plate of food from the appetizer table. She set them in front of Marisol. She looked around at the assembled faces and said, in the flattest and most earnest voice she has, well, this is really a great party. Rosa laughed. It was the slightly too high laugh of someone who has needed to laugh for 20 minutes and has finally been given permission. It spread across the head table and then across the room. Not the laughter of people who think something is funny at someone's expense, but the laughter of a room that has been holding its breath and has just been told it doesn't need to anymore. Miguel, reading the room correctly, seized the moment and the silk flower arrangement. He brought it to me. I looked at him. I said, thank you. He said something in baby Spanish that I did not fully understand, but that Marisol translated with some amusement as something approximately meaning the flower is yours. I held the silk flower. Marco watched us. He put his hands on the table. He said, "How long has the shoulder been bad?" He said it the way someone says a thing when they have noticed it and have been not saying anything for too long. I said, "Since Bagram." He said, "You never told me that." I said, "You never asked." He said, "No, I didn't." He was quiet. He said, "I'm asking now." So I told him about the vehicle rollover at the forward operating base and the specialist in the passenger seat and the 37 minutes I spent in that vehicle holding the angle I needed to hold to monitor his airway while the crew worked. I told him the specialist's name was James Kohler and he was 22 years old and from Billings, Montana, and he went home. I told him I needed surgery on the shoulder because of the position I'd maintained. I told him about the flight back and the physical therapy and the way the cold got into it years later in the desert at night. Marco listened to all of it without speaking. When I finished, he said, "You've never told me any of this." I said, "No." He said, "Why not?" I looked at him. I said, "Because by the time I came back, the person I might have told it to had developed a framework where the work I did was a function of a system that shouldn't exist. And I didn't know how to give you the inside of it while you were busy with the outside of it. I didn't know how to say, here is what it felt like to be in that vehicle while you were describing what vehicles like that one mean structurally. Those are both real things, but they need different rooms." He said, "That's fair." I said, "I know." Consuelo reached across the table and put her hand over mine. She said, "Eat your dinner, Leah. The chicken is actually good." I ate my dinner. Marisol ate the food Tina had brought. Miguel was passed with his complete and somewhat imperious consent first to Tina, who held him with the ease of someone who has stabilized more chaotic situations than a healthy toddler, and then to Rosa, who abandoned the head table entirely and came to sit with us and held him with the expertise of someone who grew up with younger siblings and was not going to let a child this age exist in a room without being held. Rosa talked to Marisol in Spanish that was better than mine and worse than Consuelo's and exactly right for the occasion. Consuelo produced another plate of food from somewhere and set it in front of Marco, who had not eaten, and he ate it without ceremony. At some point, the DJ brought the music back up, gradually and then not gradually. Someone cleared a space for dancing, and Rosa's friends pulled her away, and the choreography they had clearly been practicing for months came out in a burst of organized joy, and the quinceañera resumed being the event it was supposed to be. Marisol stayed for another 2 hours. She and I sat at the edge of the room while the dancing happened, and I asked her about what had come after the desert. She had been treated at a hospital in Tucson. She had gone through a process I understood the shape of, but not the details of, because that was not my part of the work, and she shared what she was comfortable sharing. She had family in El Paso. She had been there for 2 years. She was working. Miguel was in a daycare run by a woman who was, she said, very strict about the nap schedule. And she said this with the tone of someone who has come to deeply appreciate a strict nap schedule. I said, "The doctors said his first 48 hours were the critical window?" She said, "Yes. Whoever found us right at the edge of it." I said, "I remember looking at him and thinking, he's fighting." She said, He always has been." She looked at him across the room where Rosa was spinning him gently, and he was making the face of someone who has decided that spinning is an acceptable experience. She said, "He doesn't know yet. He won't know for years. And when I tell him, I'm going to tell him about you." I said, "You don't have to do that." She said, "I want him to know that there are people who go into the dark when you are dying and stay until the light comes. I want him to know that is something that exists in the world." I didn't answer for a moment. I said, "That's a good thing to know." She said, "Yes." I said, "For what it's worth, I didn't know if he was going to make it. I didn't know while I was there. You don't always know. You just do what the next 45 minutes require." She said, "I know." That's what I mean. You did it without knowing. The party wound down the way these things do, in stages. People hugging at the door, the DJ's smoke machine going off one more time, and Tina's hand going to her radio before she remembered she hadn't brought it. Teenagers helping stack chairs. Rosa accepting the final round of embraces with the graceful exhaustion of someone who has been the center of attention for 4 hours and is genuinely ready for it to end. Marco found me near the door when I was getting my jacket from the coat table. He was a big man and he was trying to take up less space than he naturally did, which was something I had never seen him try before. He said, "I owe you more than a conversation at a party." I said, "You don't owe me anything." He said, "I'm not going to argue that tonight. I'm going to say that I want to come visit you out there in Arizona. I want to see the work." I said, "The work isn't really something you can visit." He said, "Then describe it to me. All of it, the whole version. The way you described Bagram tonight, I want to hear it." I said, "That's going to take a while." He said, "I have time." I said, "Okay." He hugged me the way he has hugged me since I was 14 years old, which is the hug of a man who is larger than his emotions but not fully able to contain them, and my bad shoulder protested and I didn't mention it. I hugged him back. Consuelo appeared beside him and hugged me next, and said in my ear that she expected me at Sunday dinner next week. I said I'd be there. Tina and I drove back toward the highway in my old truck with the cracked dashboard and the heating system that makes a sound for the first 5 minutes like something is deeply wrong and then settles into being fine. Tina had her feet on the dashboard, which I have told her 17 times is where she would put them through the windshield in a serious collision, and which she considers a theoretical concern. She was eating the last of the gas station jerky she had been carrying in her coat pocket since the morning. She said, "How are you?" I said, "I don't know yet." She said, "That's honest." I said, "Did you know she was coming?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, I did." She said, "The volunteer coordinator reached out to me 3 weeks ago." She said, "Someone was looking for you. A woman from El Paso who had been in the desert 3 years ago and had tracked down your name through the unit records. She said she'd heard you had family in San Antonio and that the quinceañera was happening and she wanted to know if it was okay." I said it was your call to make. She said she was going to come anyway. Tina looked at the window. She said, "I figured you didn't need to spend the whole drive bracing for something, so I didn't tell you. I'm not sorry." I said, "I know." She said, "She drove 4 hours." I said, "I know." We drove without talking for a while. The highway was mostly empty and the city had thinned out to the kind of scattered lights you get at the edges of things, where buildings give way to stretches of dark ground. I thought about the desert at night, which I know better than any landscape I have ever known, the way the temperature drops faster than your body predicts it will. The way the stars are so clear and so numerous that they look invented. The way the human body, which is an extraordinary machine built to last, still has a threshold past which it cannot continue without someone else's intervention. The way finding that threshold in another person and not letting them cross it is the whole job reduced to its simplest form. I said, "I still don't know if what I do is the right answer to the wrong problem." Tina said, "Yeah." I said, "I mean that as an actual question, not rhetorical." She said, "I know. I don't have that answer either. I know what the 45 minutes in the desert are. I don't know what the policy answer is. I know both of those things are true at the same time." I said, "Marco's going to say he was right about the structural critique." She said, "He was right about the structural critique, and he was wrong about you. Those can both be true at the same time, too." I drove. The heater settled. My shoulder ached, and I let it. I thought about Miguel with his round eyes and his silk flower and his complete confidence that whatever he wanted to reach was reachable. I thought about him at 3 years old eating pink cake at a quinceañera with no knowledge of what had happened to him before he was old enough to form memories. I thought about what it meant that he was there, not what it proved about anything, not what it settled or resolved, just that he was there, alive, with frosting on his face, grabbing Rose's earring with the total certainty of someone who has decided it belongs to him. That is the thing about the people you find in the field. You find them at their most reduced. You find them when everything that normally makes a person has been stripped back by heat and thirst and fear and exhaustion, and what remains is just the most essential version. A body that needs to keep breathing and a self that is holding on beneath the body's failure. And you are the person who is going to help them do that for the next 45 minutes. And then the helicopter comes and they go somewhere that is not yours. And you go back to the truck and you go back to the desert and you add their name to the count of the ones who made it. And you go back out. Marisol finding me did not change what the work is. It did not resolve the structural questions. It did not change my uncle's politics or make the desert smaller or the summers shorter. What it did was give me back a specific face, a specific child, and show me that the face now belonged to a boy who grabbed flowers and ate cake and held on with both hands to whatever he decided was worth holding. 3 weeks after Rosa's quinceañera, Marco came to San Antonio. He brought tamales. He sat at the kitchen table, the same kitchen table where he had sat the week my father died, and I told him about the work, not the structural analysis of it, not the policy framework. I told him about the desert. I told him what the pack weighs and what it feels like to carry it 3 miles into terrain that doesn't have a road. I told him about reading the land for signs of where people have walked, the bent creosote, the abandoned bottle, the marks in the dust. I told him about the heat that is not like regular heat. The heat that has a quality of active hostility, that makes you understand on a cellular level why living things require water. I told him about the math of a body in extreme dehydration, the numbers that tell you precisely how much time you have. I told him about the people I've found who made it and the people I found who didn't. And I told him about the ones I didn't find in time and the ones I didn't find at all, which is the part nobody usually asks about, and which is the part that lives in me in the specific way that things you can't change always live in you. He listened for 2 hours. He asked real questions, the kind that came from someone who was trying to understand and not from someone who was building a response. He made the structural critique twice, and both times he framed it as what he believed about systems and not as what he believed about me. I told him I understood the distinction, and I also thought the distinction was sometimes used as a way to make the argument without taking responsibility for where it landed on the specific person sitting across from you. He said, "You might be right about that." I said, "I know." He said, "When did you get this direct with me?" I said, "I've always been this direct. I think you stopped listening at some point." He said, "I think you're right." My Aunt Consuelo brought coffee and sat down and started a separate conversation with my mother about a neighbor and a new dog, and Marco and I sat at our end of the table in the quiet that follows when two people have finally said the true things and haven't resolved everything but have at least stopped pretending. We were not done. We were not going to be done with one conversation. The critique he has of the system is not wrong because he misapplied it to me, and I know that. The work I do is real and also exists within a context I have to be willing to look at, and I know that too. We were not going to be done, but we were sitting at the same table and we were both being honest, and the coffee was good and the shoulder only hurt a little. I exchange messages with Marisol. Not often. She sends me photographs sometimes. Miguel at his birthday. Miguel at a park with a small plastic dump truck that he received as a gift and which he now carries everywhere, including, apparently, to bed, which Marisol describes with the exhausted humor of someone who has accepted that the dump truck is a permanent member of the household. He is growing fast the way children do at that age, shooting up between one photo and the next so that each one shows someone slightly different from the last. He has a wide smile that he deploys with complete confidence in its effectiveness. I do not need the photographs to do the work. The work is the same every morning, regardless of what I know about the outcomes. I drive the truck out and I carry the pack and I find the people who need to be found and I do the 45 minutes that needs doing. That is the work, and it does not require an audience and it does not require an outcome. I can verify. Most of the time I don't verify it. Most of the time I hand someone off and drive back and I never know. But I am glad Marisol drove 4 hours and crossed a fellowship hall and found my table. I am glad that the people in my life who love me and have sometimes failed to see me were in the room when she did. There is a moment that happens sometimes in the desert after a long shift, when the sun is coming up and the air still has the cool of the night in it before the heat arrives. You drive back on roads that are essentially approximations of roads, and the sky goes through every color it knows, and your body is tired in the specific way of having been used for what it was built to do. In those moments, I have always thought that the work is its own justification. That what happens in the dark does not need a witness to have been real. That I do not need anyone's framework or anyone's approval for the 45 minutes to matter. That is still true. And it is also true that a boy who carries a dump truck to bed and grabbed a silk flower and handed it to me at a quinceañera in San Antonio is 3 years old and healthy and growing, and that I know his name, and that his mother knew mine, and that knowing each other's names is the smallest and most human form of proof that any of it happened. Some things you carry for years because you don't know where else to put them. The desert taught me that the carrying is part of the work, but even the desert, after a long enough night, gives way to morning. The people who do the work in the dark do not always get to choose who sees them, but the ones they saved always remember.